I shouldn't, hold white people today, sort of ransom or say, you're responsible for the atrocities of the transatlantic slave trade. The burden of carrying that kind of resentment destroys you as a person, and that's unfortunately ideologically, where I was and where many of the people that I affiliated with and associated with in that season of my life.
Coming up on British Thought Leaders, I sit down with Joel Brown, a GP who says he used to be a power-hungry race-aholic. Coming to the UK as a young black man, Joel says he awakened into an identity that was consumed by his race.
The problem is if you view history with an ideological lens where you sort of, you have this way of interpreting events according to that ideological agenda, and you interpret history in a certain way, and it makes you vulnerable to being swept into, I think, extremism.
He says movements such as Black Lives Matter appeal to those who've experienced hardships, but can leave people feeling jaded about the world and destroy their relationships with others.
I have no problem in embracing my heritage, of being of Jamaican, birth, Afro-Caribbean descent, and embracing the skin I'm in. But the deepest sense of my identity, does not, rest in my skin color. It does not rest in the cultural assumptions about what my skin color says I should prioritize, or what issues or causes I should align with, or even politically what I should align with. There is this deeper sense of acceptance of who I am at a much more fundamental level.
I'm Lee Hall. This is British Thought Leaders. Joel Brown, thank you for joining us on British Thought Leaders.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
So I was hoping you could just give us some background. Who is Joel Brown and how you kind of went through life to get to the point where we are now?
Yeah, of course. So, where do I start? So I'm a medical doctor. I love my work, but I'm also a husband, a father. I'm of Jamaican heritage. I was born there, and I live in the UK. And it's been quite interesting. Just so much we're going to get into in the conversation today. But I mean, effectively, I'm a creative. As I said, I'm a professional as well. And I love to talk about the world and what are the values that are important to us as a society. And it's been just really interesting, just kind of seeing the world unfold in the last year or two. And I've got a lot that I've had to say on Twitter about it. But yeah.
So you moved from Jamaica over to the UK when you were 9, was that?
Actually, it was a bit later, so I was around 15. Parents moved here from Jamaica. My mum was originally born in London, and so for her it was a bit more of a return to the UK. Of course, with her husband, myself, and my 2 younger siblings, and we went all the way up to the sunny part of, it's not very sunny actually, we went up to Bradford, where I started, did my A-levels and went on to medical school.
And did you notice much of a difference as a young black guy in England compared to being in Jamaica?
Yeah, so interestingly, when I left Jamaica, I think being black was almost like this sort of, it was a reality that I didn't have to kind of question or really have to navigate. I mean, everyone around me, or majority of the culture, or the people around me rather, and even the kind of cultural understanding, there was this sense, of course, you're black, and the doctors around you are black, the police officers, the prime minister. So it was just, that there was never any sense of, any particular career options were off the table for me versus others or anything like that. I think when I came to the UK, obviously I'm now kind of immersed into a culture where being black, I guess I sort of felt, I'm a so-called minority, and there was that sense or that feeling or navigating that when I first came. And I think for me, if I'm honest, I mean, I could say this, categorically, that I didn't experience any, significant hostility. It was more or less a kind of a cultural sort of experience of, navigating what it means to be British, how do Brits talk about different things? When a British person expresses something to you, how to kind of navigate these cues and figure out how to have conversations. But I mean, I was fairly ambitious. With parents that instilled really strong values about education and just about diligence as a young child. So I came in to my focused on my education really, and wanted to aspire to become a doctor. So really kind of focused in on that.
So on your Substack, you said you became a power-hungry race-aholic. I wondered if you could tell us about your journey to kind of get to that point and what that meant.
Yeah. So, a power-hungry race-aholic. I remember when the words came to me, to describe, what had really happened in the last few years. And it would be useful for me to kind of take you back. So when I first came to the UK, particularly Bradford as a city, there were quite a bit of racial tensions, but it was primarily the sort of South Asian population and the white population in Bradford. It was on the sort of heels of some race riots at that time, and back in 2001 or so when I first came to the UK. And I remember sort of like navigating that and kind of feeling like a bit of a spectator. So I just didn't quite understand why it was so tense. But as I said, I didn't particularly feel that it was about me, and I just kind of got on with life. But I found that as I got through university, I became more and more sort of race conscious or race aware as the years went by, as I started to kind of become more focused on, I think my politics started to evolve slowly, where I sort of started to think about, what happened in the slave trade and the consequence of kind of, looking at different groups in society, so black people in society, what experiences are they having, what level of social mobility, how well are they doing, are there sort of issues that they face as a result of the legacy of sort of historic, sort of challenges that they've faced, and so I started to become more aware, and then I also had some internal identity issues because I started to feel like, okay, well, there is this question about what does it mean to be of course, a young man, and what does it mean to be a black man in this society? And so I became more and more focused on this idea that my blackness needed to be more explicit. I needed to somehow, there was this awakening into this identity. And I think when I talk about becoming a race-aholic, as a sort of a turn of phrase or an expression, I think I became quite addicted to this idea of either fitting in or sort of, I guess, my race determining my outlook in life. So it's like to be a black person means you need to face and view the world in a certain way. You need to think about, what, for instance, the problems that black people face as a collective. I need to think about this as something that we're in a struggle together, that sort of thing. And white people, for instance, I started to adopt this idea that that they perhaps maybe weren't aware of history as much as I seem to be becoming more awakened into, and that they somehow need to be taught about the legacy of the disadvantages that black people faced. And as a result of this, I think that there was this sense in which I just became consumed by race and hyper aware of what race should mean as it relates to how one navigates the world, how one interacts with each other, and it just continued to snowball. And there's so much more I could get into in terms of the effect of that.
Was this the time when Black Lives Matter became really popular in society?
So that's useful for me to acknowledge. So I had my racial awareness journey developing before the full-blown explosion of Black Lives Matter around George Floyd's, death. So so just to go back a little bit, so when I went off to university, and I kind of went in there with not a massive amount of kind of racial awareness. Of course, in my year group, there was I was a handful of sort of black students, but we just got on with university life, and didn't feel I particularly faced any sort of, as I said, hardships as a result of my race. Medical school was tough, but pursued that, but it wasn't until sort of later, having I started to go through a process of a faith crisis, as it were. And I think that it was the faith crisis because I grew up in a Christian home, grew up in a fairly conservative Christian home, and I started to have these sort of issues and questions about my faith. How do I know my faith is true? How do I know the Bible is true or reliable? And so these kind of deep questions started to undermine, the confidence that I had in my faith, and so around about that time was when I became more aware of more cynical views of the influence of Christianity around the time of the transatlantic slave trade, and there was a sense in which I should feel like any association with Christianity is a tacit sort of approval of the kind of the machinations of the colonial empire at that time, and that somehow I wanted to distance myself from Christianity, and so what I viewed to be its sort of imperialist kind of roots. And so that was the kind of ideology that started to overcome me. And so I remember, that there was a point in which I found myself just, abandoning the faith entirely. I just was consumed by anger and frustration about, almost like I felt like I was duped into a religious system, into a way of being in the world where I was in total denial of the fact that history had conspired against me because I'm black and my people. We should be frustrated and angry, and that's the way that I was consumed. So I abandoned religion. Was considered myself a kind of fairly militant atheist. Actually, I was quite anti-religion for this season. So this was prior to Black Lives Matter, and then of course Black Lives Matter and George Floyd's death brought things on to just brought such an international awareness of this issue, and so I certainly became even more vocal. At this time I was using more social media, Facebook rather, to sort of chastise those around me, including friends and family who had either gone to church with, or now consider them part of the system of conspiring against the justice that black people deserve. And these issues, it's a shame that it has taken this long for society to wake up to this reality, and that's the sort of place that I was in, and as I said, it eroded relationships very, very terribly, and I just became a person that was just not very pleasant to be around, and as I said, it's just hypercritical and very jaded about the world.
How did your friends and family take this change in you?
It was a struggle. Like I mentioned, I'm married. My wife, who took it was really hard for her, and she remained loving towards me and supportive towards me, but I was so negative about her faith. My parents, who were so loving and supportive of me, again pushed people away who loved me, and I've spoken about this a lot on Twitter, that I've had to go through a process of real grief about this, and penitence, and trying to it's not been easy, of course, for those people who endured that kind of hostility from me, but also for me to kind of reconcile that, and of course I've had to go back to many of these people that I feel like I've sort of had been hurt by some of how I responded in that season of my life, and it certainly wasn't easy, and particularly friends, white friends who couldn't understand fully what was going on with me, because it felt like as if I'd sort of adopted this view of the world in which they could be nothing but enemies, despite the fact that we had beautiful relationships, prior to this. It's like the lens through which I now viewed the world and viewed relationships with these people was so distorted that I couldn't distinguish my own ideological presumptions from reality anymore.
When something to the scale of Black Lives Matter happens, do you think it's easy to kind of get swept along with the current of all of that?
Absolutely. I think there was something very visceral about what happened, even if we go back to George Floyd, and we can have a discussion about what happened, and of course the tragedy of the loss of his life and the visceral way in which it happened, I think resonated with a lot of people, and rightly so. I think we can have a discussion to say that, there could have been a better way that situation could have been handled, but the way in which the narrative around that story was spun into sort of being used as this is the representation of, or the vicarious sort of representation of the Black experience, that we are all baptized into some kind of expression of being asphyxiated, almost suffocated by systems of oppression that we have no control over. And then Black Lives Matter as a response to that, to say, okay, we need to, as a society, affirm that, or at least make the claim that Black lives don't matter in society because of the fact that instances of these types of events happen, and society need to rally around this banner of this idea of Black Lives Matter, as a means to say, look, these injustices, we have to be able to directly accuse society as being the sort of toxic sort of cesspool of racism where Black people can't thrive at all, and that there is an appeal to that a lot of people, especially those who may be feeling like they've not got an outlet for purpose in their lives, they've lost the sense of wonder and beauty about the complex world we live in. It's not a perfect world at all, and I think for me, because I was already quite jaded and bitter about the world, having described what I went through with my faith and a sense of, as I said, history. We know that history is complicated. The problem is if you view history with an ideological lens where you sort of, you have this way of interpreting events according to that ideological agenda, and you interpret history in a certain way, and it makes you vulnerable to being swept into, I think, extremism. I think that Black Lives Matter as an idea originally in the minds of many people who heard it are like, yeah, of course, the statement is not particularly controversial. But I think what became clearer to many, and I actually remember getting the pushback when I, for instance, when you say Black Lives Matter, and then oftentimes someone would say, yeah, but all lives matter. But then there was this debate about, well, is it wrong to say that? Is somehow saying all lives matter undermining the truth of Black Lives Matter? And then there was this. I think it became clear that the phrase, while it might have, in the minds of many, was just a simple kind of rallying call for saying, okay, is there an issue around police brutality that seems to be, more predominant in terms of at least in the American context, focused on a Black person experiencing that more often than a white person, and is it important to have a conversation about racial disparities and experience of injustices, and that in itself not being unreasonable, but the way in which Black Lives Matter, I think, as a rallying call, it sort of became a way to sort of. I think it caused a breakdown in social cohesion between different races of people, and people felt like that phrase was used to it was politicized in a way that was different from just whatever the moral considerations might have been, and yes. So your question about did it cause a lot of people to get swept into to a particular way of viewing the world? Is the world, just obscenely racist, where black people are oppressed to the degree that they have to be worried that their livelihood, they won't have the same freedoms as people who are white, and that's just not the world that we largely live in the West. Yes, no one is denying that racism exists in different ways, and people have experiences where they, that they can sort of attest to that. But it's the way in which that idea was used to frame a narrative about the world that we live in that is, as I said, is just insufferably racist, and then white people are everywhere around you are complicit in that. And I think that was the hysteria that the Black Lives Matter movement and ideology, I think, helped to cultivate, unfortunately. And as I said, I went to a few of the rallying marches. I remember holding my youngest child, she had only been maybe 3-4 months, and carrying her along to one of the marches in Leeds around that time post George Floyd's death. And again, as I said, my intentions was just the solidarity of the moment. But I think there were lots of people there who also went with good intentions, but then subsequently the mentality, I think, became quite corrosive in terms of how we, interacted with other people who may have had slightly different views, and people who were just labeled as racist for just disagreeing. If someone didn't put a black square up on their social media or didn't put Black Lives Matter, they're automatically part of the system that are trying to, oppress and keep black people oppressed. That sort of that's the kind of unfortunate hysteria that I think a lot of young people particularly got swept into.
And so what was it for you that encouraged you to kind of change your thinking somewhat?
And I think in terms of this question about how and why did I change, it's oftentimes I've been asked it in interviews, and I think the answer sometimes varies, because it's not been easy to just pinpoint a precise moment where the light bulb switched on. I think for me there was a process. There was a process of self-examination. There was a process of therapy. I had to acknowledge I was quite depressed at the time, and I think when you're depressed and you view the world in a really jaded way, and you feel this sort of a level of resentment, everything so there is a sense of confirmation bias that you look for the things that consolidates the sort of world that you kind of almost want to believe is so if you want to believe the world is utterly racist and totally oppressive, you will look for the things that confirms that reality. And I think that it started to become clear to me, even with the way that I interacted with my own children. I could only see them as almost like objects that I needed to save from this crushingly racist world. And it was the loss of the sense in which I feel like I just lost that joy in life, and these relationships lay in ruin as a result of some of how I'd become. Those started to awaken a sense of this real grief that I just had a life that I just felt was just in a sorry, sordid state of disarray. And so that feeling wouldn't go away the self-examination and the sort of recognition of what was kind of going on in my mind, and seeking therapy and getting help with that was a part of the journey. There was also a spiritual part of this journey as well, because having got to that place where there was this total rejection of God and rejection of truth, and almost seeing that we should design and redesign, the word that we often use was, dismantle the world, the power structures that be, and whiteness is this sort of construct that is inherently unfair, and white people have the advantage or the privilege over the rest of us, and so we need to participate in dismantling this system so to make a world that's more equitable. And these are sort of the ideas that I embraced, and sort of realizing again that those ideas were, the best way of putting them, I feel like they weren't true, and I think they were just an exaggerated way of describing, and they missed the mark in so many ways in terms of describing the nuanced nature of the challenges that we face in our world, and creates a sort of generalizations about white or black people that are unhelpful towards the kind of social cohesion that's necessary in our society to move forward. And so for me, kind of recognizing that the state of mind that I was in spiritually, psychologically, coming into a place of renewal in my faith as a result of going through some of this healing, and actually revisiting some of what I thought about history, and realized actually I had a very distorted view, and I looked at some other facts that corroborated that actually there is a more nuanced way of looking at even Christianity's involvement, or the church, and the church's involvement in sort of historical injustices, and actually realizing that my faith and the faith of my parents, my faith in Christ and my grandparents has been a real just lighthouse for me, and actually seeing that that the restoration of that has been a real crucial part of the journey for me, of just coming out of that, and it's been a continued journey of just realigning with truth.
It seems you had several battles going on.
Yeah.
I think one of them is a battle for identity.
Yeah.
You talk to us a bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I just remember coming to the UK and feeling quite proud and excited about the opportunity, to be part of, the nation, and to have a chance to get a great education, and to join a career, that I felt like I could do some good in the world. And there was a boy in the middle of all of that. I was just trying to figure out, what is it, who am I, and what am I? What is my purpose? And why am I here? And I think I part of this journey for me, and where I ended up and how I ended up there, I think there was a fragmentation and a kind of a loss of that sense of who I was, and feeling that I had to find it in some ideology that would somehow maybe fully explain things that didn't make sense to me. For instance, I remember one of the questions I asked myself is, how did I end up with the surname Brown if I'm of African descent? I started to then have this kind of reductive way of viewing it. Well, maybe, of course, the likelihood my name was inherited from, someone who owned a plantation in Jamaica by the name of Brown. And so I remember just feeling at this time, this early part of the deconstruction of my worldview and my faith and so on, there was this sense of, it's this wrestling with identity. What does it mean to be who I am? And I think where I've come to now, and what's so crucial when I talk about this on social media, is that I have no problem in embracing my heritage of being of Jamaican, birth, Afro-Caribbean descent and embracing the skin I'm in. But the deeper sense of my identity, does not, rest in my skin color. It does not rest in the cultural assumptions about what my skin color says I should prioritize, or what issues or causes I should align with, or even politically what I should align with. There is this deeper sense of acceptance of who I am at a much more fundamental level. My faith is absolutely core with that. Excuse me. Just understanding my faith in Christ, the heritage that means to me in terms of my values, in terms of my sort of why, the love I therefore should have towards all people, regardless of their race, regardless of their gender. And I shouldn't, hold white people today, sort of ransom, or say, you're responsible for the atrocities of the transatlantic slave trade. The burden of carrying that kind of resentment destroys you as a person, and that's unfortunately ideologically, where I was and where many of the people that I affiliated with and associated with in that season of my life. And I'm just grateful to just be in a place where I feel much more whole, rather than feeling like my entire identity is summed up in, some political ideology that's rooted in my quote unquote race. I'm a human being, and I'm here to figure that out, and how we can figure that out together and love each other and be more honest and open and have discussions about the challenging issues that face our world today.
The other battle you had going on is a faith battle. I think your father, your grandfather were quite moral and spiritual people.
Yeah.
Did that kind of set quite a high bar for you to try and follow?
Yeah, and it's interesting because I remember when my grandmother died in 2019, and my grandmother was, she retired, 60s, 70s, and she was a high school principal of a very, an extremely well-run school in Jamaica. And she was a faithful Anglican for all of her life. And I didn't know how much her legacy was grounded in her faith until her funeral. Because so much of what she did, I discovered at the funeral. So I remember being there in the countryside in Jamaica. It was this, just really beautiful sunny day in the church in Clarendon in the countryside. And there were all these women that came dressed in purple at the funeral, and there was just this regal flood of purple dresses at the funeral. And they all spoke about my grandmother, and this was afterwards at the after meal, saying that she was the woman that would make sure I should make clear that these women that came in purple were the ex-students of the school that she.
Oh, right.
So they all came down to the funeral. There were hundreds of them there, and they were so impacted, and all the stories just confirmed how much my grandmother's, her values, the belief in every child being, a child of God and gifted and deserving of an opportunity of education, regardless of their background. So she would oftentimes bring in her own lunch she would give to another child who didn't have lunch, because she didn't want the child to be hungry and not be able to focus in their lessons. She, even at a time in Jamaica where some of the poor children didn't have access to the school that she was principal over, really advocated for wanting to be able to give those children an opportunity at an education. And so just kind of understanding how her faith had hands and feet and were practical and was very much such a driving force behind the influence of her life. I just remembered feeling at the time, pondering that, and I was at that stage when she died in 2019, my faith was just in disarray. I would have considered myself spiritual, but not religious. That was the kind of phase I was in. So it's kind of gone through the hard atheism phase, and I was kind of softening to the idea that maybe spirituality is just, just be a kind person. So I just remembered feeling this awareness of how the legacy of her faith, how that informed her whole life, her mission, her work, the kind of person. And yes, there was a sense in which I just remember feeling so small and so just gosh, how does one live up to a life like this, and how does one belittle, the faith, this level of faithfulness that is rooted in one's Christian faith, just because, and I think I've evolved a more sophisticated, non-religious spirituality where religion is this archaic set of ideas that doesn't do the world that much good now, and we've evolved and we need to move on from that. And though that was, it certainly challenged me. And I will touch on what you said about sometimes when you have that kind of legacy. I've seen it in a few friends of mine who've come out of Christian homes or had parents who were pastors and involved in ministry, and the pressure became too much, and they sort of end up kind of rebelling from that. And I sort of thought I escaped that, because most of my friends who say grew up with Christian parents or had that strong heritage, they went through the rebellious phase in their teens, and early 20s, and then sort of eventually kind of grew out of that and sort of came home to the realization that actually, faith grounds you, keeps you, and helps you live a life of meaning and purpose. But I remained in the church and remained faithful and was involved in ministry right up until this happened. So it wasn't until my 2 kids were born that I went through this this faith crisis.
What would you say to someone who's still kind of in this victim mentality now?
Yeah. One of the things that I've tried to get right in terms of a balance when I discuss this is, I think there are true victims of, they've experienced hardships, whether that's based on, violence towards them, unfair treatment of any kind, whether that's race-based or not. And that we can acknowledge that those experiences can be hard to navigate, difficult emotionally to overcome. But then there comes a point where one can self-identify with those experiences to the point that they lose, that there is this hopelessness and there is this inability to move forward with one's life, and that's victimhood. And I think victimhood is what I would describe as the greatest obstacle, or actually one of the words I liked is most toxic, sort of obstacles to maximizing human potential. And I think recognizing that is not easy, because oftentimes when you're in a place where you're so consumed by the idea that you are a victim, that sums up the entirety of your existence and almost purpose in life. You will see every challenge, every obstacle as some grand conspiracy to keep you from progressing, to keep you from flourishing. And even for someone like me who had all the right things, I had 2 parents who loved each other. My parents been married for 41 years last month, loved me, corrected me, gave me opportunity, sacrificed for me. When they came to the UK, it was a massive sacrifice for them both, but they believed it was the right transition to give myself and my siblings, that opportunity so I had all of that, and despite that, and then even being a doctor, and then, and having all of this, victimhood became this. It's almost like as if I took this chalice, this bitter chalice, and of resentment and victimhood, and nearly lost everything, and certainly lost a lot. But what I would say to someone who's trapped there is, you don't have to stay there. And part of the reason I have these conversations and I use Twitter in this way to talk about these issues is that I'm desperate to sound that, to offer that message of hope to those who feel like I'm stuck in this mold, in this way of viewing the world that sees that there's almost like there's no way out. It's this abyss of despair, and that everybody's out to get me, and especially this notion that we are, as black people, for instance, so hemmed in by oppression that we aren't able to to move forward. I think that I would just my hope, my prayer, my encouragement to them is to take the first steps to to heal from whatever it is that you might be going through that has perhaps made you vulnerable to accepting that sort of kind of sentence of or that sort of kind of view of the world, and try and engage in a journey towards the support that you need. I think a lot of that will be community based. That's one of the beauties of faith, and my faith being able to, it was so easy to kind of isolate myself and be on this journey on my own, but being able to be in community with other people that can help me, because I consider myself now someone who's, in recovery. It's very much like with when you've been addicted to anything, whether it's alcohol or cocaine, if you're addicted to this victimhood mentality, you've got to guard yourself from returning to that, through like with anything, you avoid it like the plague. And I say this all the time: run from any ideology that gives you that almost this permission to see yourself as this perpetual victim, because you'll run to it naturally if that's been your issue.
On that subject, I think in today's society there are a lot of disparities.
Yeah.
But we see things such as social media, and everyone seems to be on a yacht or on a private jet or something. Yeah. And I wonder what role people wanting what others have, or seeing all these perfect lives on the social media, etc., has in pushing them towards an ideology that makes them the victim.
Yeah, I think that's true. Like, social media, I've often heard it said, social media is not reality, and you have to remind yourself, the way that social media is designed and set up, whether we're talking about the kind of algorithms or the adverts that are shown to you, it's all curated. It's a curated reality that you're a virtual reality that you're being offered. That's based on lots of different metrics, and it's too easy to conflate what you see with the truth of what the world is like. Of course, there are disparities. There are people who experience varying, difficulties that they have to navigate. And if you see a world where it seems that everybody around you, as you said, that is living the life, and you then feel somehow woe is me. But the truth is, oftentimes, social media shows you the highlights rather than the backstory. So even people who appear to be very successful and so on, you don't necessarily know what they've done, the work that they've put in, or how truly successful they really are. I mean, you can get a video where you've maybe borrowed some jewelry, borrowed a car, and you have this. You look like you're sort of walking around in all this wealth, and it's just props. Yeah, and that does happen a lot as well. So I think just being grounded, and I think it's actually important to take time away from social media. I say this as someone who uses social media a lot. I think it's important to just be grounded in the real world, and not be too sort of absorbed in the kind of the false curated world that social media, and allowing that to sort of mess with your mind in terms of, as you said, seeing yourself somehow as as the kind of the victim, based on the fact that you have this this very limited view of the world, for sure.
In America, recently we've seen a lot of media focus on affirmative action, and the Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional. And I just wanted to get your take on this.
Yeah, so I believe, for instance, in the context of America, where you had a history of course, that we understand there was the context of slavery, then sort of abolition, and then even after that, there was Black Americans. There was a history of other forms of discrimination, where despite the fact that the law permitted, for instance, Black Americans to be able to go to university, college, and so on, there were significant amounts of in parts of America where this was not being in principle. I mean, while in principle it should have been that they had no issues and no obstruction or disadvantage, where that was not the case. And I think affirmative action, for me, as an idea to remedy those those issues at the time, I think was the idea behind it, of saying, okay, you know what, we are going to take into account that this group of people have institutionally, certainly at that time, not been given opportunities where they have the academic ability, but they were refused. There are letters where people were refused, despite the fact that they had the potential, they were apt to be able to do it. And I think that means the means to rectify that at the time was well intended and needful. And there's some may have debates and discussion in terms of the way that affirmative action should work, because I think a lot of people sometimes, when they think about, okay, well, what is are we saying we're lowering the standards, for instance, in terms of academically for one group to be able to get in? And for me, because, like, for instance, if I think about medical school, I got into medical school, and I'd only been in the UK for a year when I applied to medical school here in the UK. Obviously, it's a different context. But I academically was, predicted, very high grades in my A levels, and did well and got in on merit, purely on my academic performance. Now, I feel that medical school is tough. It's not an easy road to get through. If you're going to let people into university and for instance, lower the academic standards, and then you're in a sense, you could argue, could you be setting them up to fail if they don't have the aptitude to actually endure that? So I think it shouldn't just be about lowering academic standards. And I don't think that that's wise or helpful. It's about, okay, if you're trying to say we want to recognize that this particularly in the context of America, where you had students who were Black and had aptitude and were saying, you can't come here because of your race, and affirmative action being used to rectify that issue, I think that's different. Now, I think where we are now in the world today, in America, I would say is the same. I would agree that affirmative action, as this notion, I think now, I feel like it's not as necessary as it was when it was first brought in. That's my view. It's purely on a race, on just purely on racial grounds, and therefore, I think for me, I would say that we should have equality, where that people should be able to. I do think a merit-based system is more appropriate in the world that we live in now. And that's as I said, so that's the nuanced view that I have, and I appreciate that there are going to be people who will have slightly different views on this as well.
If people want to follow you and find out more, where can they go?
So the best place at the moment would be Twitter. So you can find me on Twitter at Joel Brown MD. that's, yeah, that would be the best place to find me. And I'm always looking forward to have discussion. So find me on there, and I'm even willing to jump on spaces with someone who wants to maybe thrash out and challenge some of my ideas. I'm open to that. I think that's what we need more of in society.
Joel Brown, thank you for joining us on British Thought Leaders.
You're very welcome.